Why are the first walls in history built not to protect against wild beasts, but against other men? Down in the sun-scorched plains between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, a new idea was taking root. It was called civilization, and its first act was to build a wall. This wasn't a fence against lions or floods, it was a declaration. What is mine is mine, what is yours is mine if I am strong enough. Here in Sumer, humanity learned to write, to build cities, to create laws. But how did a simple clay tablet, etched with wedge-shaped marks, become a more dangerous weapon than a bronze axe? Because the tablet recorded debts, decreed taxes, and listed enemies. It organized men into armies. It turned a brawl into a war. The cities of Uruk and Lagash shimmered in the heat, monuments of mud brick and human genius. They were also fortresses, locked in a perpetual, brutal struggle for the most precious resource of all, water. Their kings were not philosophers, they were warlords. Their poetry was not of love, but of epic slaughters. History does not begin with a song. It begins with the dying scream of a farmer whose irrigation ditch has just been seized by the soldiers of a neighboring king. This was a world of primal fury. The air was thick with the dust of marching feet and the smoke of burning reed huts. Chariots, clumsy four-wheeled wagons pulled by donkeys, rumbled across the plains. They were less a shock weapon and more a mobile platform for javelin throwers. But to a line of foot soldiers armed with copper-tipped spears, they were terrifying. Sieges were not yet an art form, they were contests of starvation and despair. An army would surround a city and wait. Imagine you are standing on the walls of Uruk, the sun beating down. What is more terrifying, the gnawing hunger in your belly, or the sight of the enemy army methodically destroying the barley fields that were your only hope for survival? This cycle of violence might have continued for centuries, a bloody but localized affair, until one man decided the world wasn't big enough for more than one king. His name was Sargon. He was a cupbearer, a man of no noble birth, who seized power in the city of Akkad. He possessed a terrifying new idea, empire. Sargon of Akkad was history's first predator. He did not just want to defeat his neighbors, he wanted to own them. His campaigns were lightning fast. He forged an army of professional soldiers, loyal only to him, not to a city. He marched them relentlessly from the shores of the Persian Gulf to the mountains of Anatolia. He created the first empire, a tapestry of conquered cities, held together by fear and force. Sargon's rule was absolute. He understood a fundamental truth of power. It is not enough to conquer. You must crush the will to resist. Rebellions were met with horrifying retribution. Cities were razed, their leaders executed, their people scattered. The Akkadian Empire was a new kind of political entity, a machine designed for conquest and exploitation. The old Sumerian city-states, with their petty squabbles, were swept away. Empires are born in the desert when one man decides the thirst for power is stronger than the thirst for water. Sargon's legacy was not just in the lands he conquered, but in the idea he unleashed upon the world that all people could, and perhaps should, live under a single, all-powerful ruler. It was an idea that would drench the Middle East in blood for the next 4,000 years. His dynasty did not last. No dynasty ever does. Internal decay, endless rebellions, and invasions from barbarian tribes chipped away at the empire's foundations. Sargon's creation crumbled back into the dust from which it came. But the blueprint for empire had been drawn. The memory of a single master lingered. For a time, the city of rose again, a brief flicker of Sumerian revival. Its kings built magnificent ziggurats and penned elaborate law codes. They tried to rule through bureaucracy and order, not just brute force, but it was too late. The age of innocence, if it ever existed, was over. The game had changed. The future belonged not to the builders of temples, but to the forgers of weapons and the masters of logistics. A new power was rising from the south, a city that would give its name to a legend. Babylon. Its ruler was a man who would perfect Sargon's model, cloaking raw ambition in the robes of divine justice. He understood that a conqueror's greatest weapon is not his army, but his ability to convince the conquered that their subjugation is for their own good. The rise of Babylon was not meteoric. It was a slow, methodical game of diplomacy, espionage, and perfectly timed betrayals. Its greatest king, Hammurabi, was a master of this game. He presented himself not as a conqueror, but as a shepherd to his people, a bringer of justice. He is remembered for his code of laws, a towering stone pillar inscribed with nearly 300 judgments, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. It seems brutal to us, but in its time it was a revolution. It meant that justice, at least in theory, was not arbitrary. It was the same for the rich and the poor, the powerful and the weak. Or so the pillar claimed. The reality was a bit more complex. The punishments varied wildly depending on the social status of the perpetrator and the victim. Strike a nobleman, lose a hand. Strike a commoner, pay a fine. The law was a tool of control, a way to structure society and reinforce the power of the king. It was genius. Hammurabi, the lawgiver, was also Hammurabi, the ruthless commander. While his scribes were codifying laws, his soldiers were on the march. He played his rivals against each other with breathtaking cynicism. He would sign an alliance with one king, then use his new ally's troops to destroy another, only to turn on the ally when they were weakened and exhausted. One by one, he absorbed the old cities of Mesopotamia into his kingdom. His conquest of Lhasa was a masterpiece of military engineering and psychological warfare. He dammed a river to first deprive the city of water, then released it to flood the foundations of its walls. He united the lands of Sumer and Akkad, not with a shared culture, but with a shared fear of his army and a shared submission to his law. For a brief, shining moment, Babylon was the center of the world, a city of wealth, order, and learning. But the law of the hammer, no matter how elegantly carved in stone, is still the law of force. And there was a new power rising in the north, a people who cared little for laws, only for iron, terror, and obedience. The greatness of Babylon could not withstand a new force from the east, whose warriors knew no mercy. They were the Assyrians, and they would turn cruelty into an art form. If Hammurabi cloaked his ambition in law, the Assyrians wore their brutality like a crown. For them, terror was not a byproduct of war, it was the primary objective. Their rise was slow, a centuries-long hardening in the harsh hill country of northern Mesopotamia. They were a people forged in constant warfare, and they perfected a military machine unlike anything the world had ever seen. Their armies were a marvel of organization and technology. They were the first to make extensive use of iron weapons, which shattered the bronze swords and armor of their enemies. They mastered siege warfare. Their engineers would build enormous wooden towers that could be rolled up to a city's walls, allowing archers to rain death down upon the defenders. They used massive iron-tipped battering rams to splinter wooden gates and smash through mud-brick fortifications. They would dig tunnels to undermine walls, causing them to collapse. To face an Assyrian army was to face an inexorable, terrifying engine of destruction. What truly set the Assyrians apart was their calculated use of psychological warfare. They did not just defeat their enemies, they annihilated them, and they made sure the entire world knew about it. Assyrian kings would commission massive, detailed reliefs on the walls of their palaces, depicting their conquests in gruesome detail. You could see Assyrian soldiers flaying prisoners alive. You could see piles of severed heads. You could see men and women impaled on stakes outside the ruins of their city. This was not idle boasting, it was state policy. The message was clear: resist and this will be your fate. Surrender and you might be spared. They practiced mass deportations, uprooting entire populations and resettling them in distant corners of their empire. This broke the spirit of the conquered, severed their connection to their ancestral lands and gods, and made rebellion nearly impossible. The northern kingdom of Israel learned this firsthand. Its cities were destroyed, and its people, the so-called 10 lost tribes, were marched into oblivion. The kingdom of Judah to the south held on, but only by paying a crippling tribute. Even the great city of Babylon was not immune. When it rebelled, the Assyrian king Sennacherib besieged it, sacked it, and flooded it, leaving it a desolate swamp. At its zenith, under kings like Ashurbanipal, the Neo-Assyrian Empire was the largest the world had yet seen. Its dominion stretched from the mountains of Iran to the banks of the Nile in Egypt. Nineveh, the capital, was a city of grotesque splendor, its palaces financed by the plunder of a dozen kingdoms. Ashurbanipal's library, a vast collection of tens of thousands of clay tablets, was a testament to the empire's strange duality, a deep respect for the ancient knowledge of Mesopotamia, coupled with an unparalleled savagery. But an empire built on terror is inherently unstable. It requires ever-increasing levels of violence to maintain control. The resources required to field its massive army were a constant drain. The hatred of its subjugated peoples simmered just beneath the surface. And so the collapse of Assyria was as spectacular as its rise. A coalition of rebellious Babylonians and nomadic Medes from the Iranian plateau joined forces. In the year 612 before the Common Era, they laid siege to Nineveh itself. When the mighty city fell, the retribution was terrible. The Assyrian Empire was so utterly destroyed, its cities so thoroughly demolished, that for 2,000 years, Nineveh was little more than a name in the Bible. The world had rid itself of a monster, but in doing so, it had created a power vacuum, and history, like nature, abhors a vacuum. The fall of Assyria allowed for a brief Chaldean renaissance in Babylon. Under King Nebuchadnezzar II, the city was rebuilt on a scale of unimaginable magnificence. The legendary Hanging Gardens were constructed, a wonder of the ancient world. The Ishtar Gate, covered in brilliant blue glazed bricks and depictions of dragons and bulls, awed visitors from across the known world. It was Nebuchadnezzar who finally crushed the kingdom of Judah, destroying Jerusalem and Solomon's temple and dragging its people into the Babylonian captivity. For a moment, it seemed Babylon had reclaimed its old glory, but it was a fragile splendor. The Chaldean kings lacked the iron will of their Assyrian predecessors, and a new, far greater power was stirring in the east, on the Iranian plateau. They were a people who would unite the discipline of the Assyrians with a revolutionary new idea: tolerance. Their leader was a man whose name would become a synonym for conquest and enlightened rule. His name was Cyrus, Cyrus the Great. His rise was swift, almost unbelievable. He united the warring tribes of the Medes and the Persians. Then he turned west. In a series of brilliant campaigns, he conquered the wealthy kingdom of Lydia in Anatolia and then set his sights on Babylon itself. The city, which had defied the armies of Sennacherib, fell to Cyrus almost without a fight. He achieved this not with battering rams, but with propaganda. He portrayed himself as a liberator chosen by Babylon's own god, Marduk, to restore order. When his army reached the city, the gates were opened from within. Cyrus was a new kind of conqueror. Where the Assyrians had used terror, Cyrus used clemency. He allowed conquered peoples to keep their customs and their religions. He famously freed the Jews from their captivity in Babylon and allowed them to return to Jerusalem and rebuild their temple. This wasn't necessarily an act of kindness, it was brilliant statecraft. He understood that a willing subject is far easier to govern than an enslaved one. His Achaemenid Empire was the largest the world had ever seen, a truly multi-ethnic, multi-religious state stretching from India to the shores of the Aegean Sea. He organized it into provinces or satrapies, each ruled by a governor. He built a network of roads, most famously the Royal Road, which allowed for rapid communication and movement of troops across his vast domain. He created a single, stable currency which facilitated trade. The Persian Empire was not just a military conquest, it was an administrative marvel. His successors, like Darius and Xerxes, continued his work, though they lacked his deft political touch. They pushed the empire's borders into Europe, where they ran into a collection of small, quarrelsome city-states on the Greek peninsula. The clash between the Persian Empire and the Greeks was a collision of worlds. On one side, a vast, centralized, autocratic empire. On the other, a loose confederation of fiercely independent city-states who cherished a strange new idea called freedom. The Greco-Persian Wars have been immortalized in Western lore, the outnumbered Athenians repelling the Persian invasion at the Battle of Marathon, the 300 Spartans making their suicidal stand at the pass of Thermopylae, the Athenian navy with its agile triremes smashing the massive Persian fleet at the Battle of Salamis. From the Persian perspective, these were minor border skirmishes in a distant, unimportant province. But for the Greeks, they were defining moments, a struggle for their very existence. They had faced the greatest power on earth and, against all odds, had survived. This victory fueled an explosion of confidence and cultural achievement in Athens. But it also planted a seed of arrogance and a desire for revenge. For over a century, a tense standoff existed. The Persians meddled in Greek affairs, financing one city-state against another. The Greeks launched sporadic raids on Persian territory. The great empire of the east and the small cities of the west were locked in a cold war, but a storm was gathering in the north of Greece, in a kingdom called Macedon. A king named Philip was forging a new kind of army, and his son, a young man named Alexander, was dreaming of a world at his feet. Alexander of Macedon inherited his father's army, but his ambition was entirely his own. In the year 334 before the Common Era, he crossed the Hellespont into Asia with an army of fewer than 50,000 men. His goal was not just to punish the Persians for their past invasions, it was to conquer their entire empire. It was an act of breathtaking audacity. The Persian king, Darius III, ruled over an empire 100 times larger, with a population that outnumbered Alexander's forces by a similar margin. But Alexander had two things Darius did not: an army of veteran, professional soldiers trained in the revolutionary tactics of the Macedonian phalanx, and a supreme, almost insane self-confidence. The campaign was a whirlwind. At the Battle of the Granicus River, he shattered the first Persian army sent against him. At the Battle of Issus, he faced Darius himself. In a moment of high drama, Alexander led his elite companion cavalry in a charge directly at the Persian king. Darius panicked and fled, leaving his army to be slaughtered and his family to be captured. The heart of the Persian Empire was now open to him. He marched down the Mediterranean coast, taking the great port cities of Tyre and Gaza in brutal sieges. He entered Egypt, where he was hailed as a liberator and a pharaoh. Then he turned east again for the final confrontation. At Gaugamela, on a wide plain in what is now northern Iraq, Darius assembled a massive army drawn from every corner of his empire. Scythed chariots, elephants, and hundreds of thousands of infantry and cavalry were arrayed to crush the Macedonian invader. Alexander's army was vastly outnumbered, but he was a tactical genius. He angled his line of battle, drawing the Persian cavalry out to the flanks, creating a gap in their center. Once again, he led a decisive charge straight for Darius, and once again, Darius fled. The battle turned into a rout. The Persian Empire, the superpower that had dominated the Middle East for 2 centuries, effectively ceased to exist in a single afternoon. Alexander marched in triumph into Babylon, then Susa, then to the ceremonial capital of Persepolis. There, in an act of either calculated political vengeance or a drunken rage, he burned the magnificent palace of the Persian kings to the ground. The pursuit of the fugitive Darius III became an obsession. Alexander drove his men on a merciless chase across the deserts and mountains of Iran, only to find the Persian king murdered by one of his own governors. Alexander, the conqueror, was now Alexander, the undisputed king of Asia. His empire stretched from Greece to India. He was just 30 years old, but empires are easier to conquer than to rule. Alexander's dream was of a new culture, a fusion of Greek and Persian. He encouraged his soldiers to marry local women. He adopted Persian dress and court customs. He founded dozens of new cities, named Alexandria, to be centers of Greek learning and culture throughout his new domain. It was a vision of breathtaking ambition, but it was a vision that died with him. In the year 323 before the Common Era, in the palace of Nebuchadnezzar in Babylon, Alexander fell ill with a fever and died at the age of 32. He left no heir. His empire, held together only by the force of his personality, immediately shattered. His generals, the Diadochi or successors, fell upon each other in a series of brutal civil wars that lasted for decades. The Middle East was carved up into new kingdoms: the Ptolemaic kingdom in Egypt, the Seleucid kingdom in Persia and Mesopotamia. This was the beginning of the Hellenistic era, an age where Greek culture spread across the East. But it was also an age of constant warfare, as Alexander's successors battled endlessly over the fragments of his legacy. A new power was watching these squabbles from across the sea. It was a republic, methodical and ruthless, and its symbol was an eagle. The legions of Rome were coming. Would you rather have lived under the stable, multicultural rule of the Persian Empire, or in the chaotic but culturally vibrant world left behind by Alexander? Tell us your choice and why in the comments below. The arrival of Rome in the East was not a sudden invasion. It was a slow, creeping advance, a gradual absorption of territory through alliances, protectorates, and occasional brutal military interventions. The bickering Hellenistic kingdoms were no match for the disciplined legions. One by one, they fell under Roman influence and then under direct Roman rule. In the year 63 before the Common Era, the general Pompey the Great marched into Jerusalem, ending the independence of the Jewish Hasmonean kingdom and making Judea a Roman client state. The Middle East was now the eastern frontier of a new, even larger empire. But this frontier was not a peaceful one. To the east lay a formidable rival, the Parthian Empire. The Parthians were a nomadic people from the Iranian plateau who had driven out the Seleucids. Their army was built around one of the most effective military units in history, the horse archer. Parthian cavalrymen, mounted on swift horses, could rain arrows on an enemy and then feign retreat, luring them into a trap. This was the famous Parthian shot. For the Roman legions, with their slow-moving heavy infantry, the Parthian horse archers were a tactical nightmare. The centuries-long struggle between Rome and Parthia was a bloody stalemate, fought across the deserts of Mesopotamia and the mountains of Armenia. It was a war of ambushes, raids, and sieges of remote frontier forts. The most infamous Roman disaster came in the year 53 BCE. The ambitious and fantastically wealthy Marcus Licinius Crassus led an army of 7 legions into Parthian territory. At the Battle of Carrhae, his legions were surrounded on an open plain by a smaller Parthian force of horse archers. For hours, the Romans stood in their dense formations, helplessly absorbing volley after volley of arrows. Their own cavalry was destroyed, their javelins were useless. When they tried to advance, the Parthians would simply retreat, firing backwards as they went. The result was a slaughter. Crassus was killed, and the golden eagles of his legions, the sacred standards of Rome, were captured. It was a humiliation that would haunt Rome for generations. The dream of conquering the East had died in the Mesopotamian dust. An empire can conquer any fortress except the one built in the human heart. And the hearts of the people of the Middle East burned with a quiet resentment against their new masters. Nowhere was this resentment stronger than in the small, troublesome province of Judea. The Jews, fiercely monotheistic, refused to pay homage to the Roman gods or the deified emperor. They chafed under Roman taxation and the rule of corrupt governors. Tensions simmered for decades, fueled by messianic prophecies and calls for rebellion. In the year 66 of the Common Era, the explosion finally came. The Great Jewish Revolt was a war of shocking brutality on both sides. It was a guerrilla war fought in the hills of Galilee, a war of desperate last stands in desert fortresses like Masada. The climax was the Roman siege of Jerusalem. The city was packed with pilgrims and torn apart by internal factions who fought each other as fiercely as they fought the Romans. The legionaries, under the command of the future Emperor Titus, surrounded the city with a wall of their own, cutting off all supplies. The starvation and suffering inside were horrific. After a months-long siege, the Romans breached the walls. The fighting in the narrow streets was hand-to-hand, a butcher's work. The city was destroyed, and the Second Temple, the center of the Jewish faith, was burned to the ground. Hundreds of thousands were killed, and thousands more were sold into slavery. The destruction of Jerusalem should have been the end, but it was not. 60 years later, another, even more desperate rebellion broke out, led by a man known as Simon Bar Kokhba, who was hailed by some as the Messiah. The Bar Kokhba revolt was a final, doomed struggle for freedom. The Roman response under the Emperor Hadrian was genocidal. The province of Judea was systematically devastated. Its cities were plowed over, its population massacred or exiled. Jerusalem was rebuilt as a Roman colony, Aelia Capitolina, and Jews were forbidden from entering it on pain of death. The land was renamed Syria Palestina. It was an attempt to erase a people from history. Yet in the shadow of this immense tragedy, a new idea was quietly spreading. It was a religion born from a Jewish sect following the teachings of a man named Jesus of Nazareth, who had been executed by the Romans decades before the first revolt. It spoke of peace, love, and salvation. It offered hope to the poor, the enslaved, and the oppressed. In the catacombs and hidden rooms of the Roman Empire, Christianity was gathering strength. This new faith, born in a land crushed by Roman eagles, would one day conquer the empire itself. Its spread was slow, almost invisible, a secret whispered from one soul to another while the legions marched and the emperors schemed. The Roman Empire, like all empires before it, eventually began to decay from within. It became too vast to govern effectively. Political instability, economic crises, and civil wars weakened its core. The eastern provinces, richer and more populous than the west, became increasingly important. In the early 4th century, the Emperor Constantine converted to Christianity, ending centuries of persecution. He moved the capital of the empire to a new city he built on the site of the ancient Greek town of Byzantium. He called it Constantinople. This was the birth of the Byzantine Empire, the Eastern Roman Empire, a Christian state that would endure for another 1,000 years. But the endless wars with the Persians, now under a new Sasanian dynasty, continued to drain its resources. The two superpowers of the ancient world bled each other white in a seemingly endless cycle of conflict. They were like two exhausted boxers, locked in a clinch, unaware of the new contender watching from outside the ring. Down in the Arabian Peninsula, a land of harsh deserts and fiercely independent nomadic tribes, a new prophet was walking the earth, and a new world-changing revelation was about to be unleashed. The man was Muhammad, a merchant from the city of Mecca. In the year 610 of the Common Era, he began to receive what he said were revelations from God, delivered by the angel Gabriel. These revelations, recorded in the Quran, spoke of a single, all-powerful God, Allah. They called for submission, or Islam, to his will. This new faith drew on the traditions of Judaism and Christianity, but it was a distinct and powerful message. It offered a vision of social justice, spiritual equality, and a united community, or ummah, that transcended the endless blood feuds of the Arab tribes. At first, he was ridiculed and persecuted, but his message resonated. He and his followers eventually fled Mecca for the city of Medina, an event known as the Hijra, which marks the beginning of the Islamic calendar. In Medina, he became not just a prophet, but a political and military leader. He united the warring tribes under the banner of Islam, creating a force of unprecedented unity and purpose. An old Arab saying goes, "I against my brother and I against my cousin and I against the world." Muhammad changed the last part. Now it was just the united Ummah against the world. When Muhammad died in the year 632, the new Islamic community faced a crisis. Who would lead? His successors were given the title of caliph, or deputy. Under the first 4 caliphs, the energy that Muhammad had unleashed exploded out of the Arabian Peninsula, with the force of a supernova. The Arab armies were small, lightly armed, and accustomed to the harsh conditions of the desert. They were not a professional military machine like the Romans or Persians, but they were driven by a fervent belief that they were fighting for God and that death in battle would lead to paradise. Their opponents, the Byzantine and Sasanian empires, were exhausted from their long wars with each other. They underestimated the threat from the desert. They saw the first Arab raids as nothing more than a nuisance. They were catastrophically wrong. The Arab conquests were one of the most stunning military achievements in human history. They were a blitzkrieg of camel cavalry and infantry that moved with a speed and ferocity that seemed to defy the laws of logistics. In the year 636, at the Battle of Yarmouk, a Byzantine army vastly larger than the Arab force was utterly annihilated. The battle took place in a dust storm which blinded the Byzantines and gave an advantage to the desert-born Arabs. With this single victory, the provinces of Syria and Palestine, which the Romans had held for 6 centuries, were lost forever. The same year, on the other front, an Arab army met the main force of the Sasanian Persian Empire at the Battle of Al-Qadisiyah. After several days of brutal fighting, the Persians were crushed. Their empire, which had rivaled Rome for centuries, crumbled. Within a few decades, the Arab Caliphate stretched from Spain in the west to the borders of India in the east. It was an empire larger than Rome's at its peak, created in a fraction of the time. Jerusalem fell, Alexandria fell. The old world was swept away. The conquerors were not just warriors. They brought with them a new language, Arabic, and a new religion, Islam, which would permanently reshape the cultural and spiritual landscape of the Middle East. But this new empire was not without its own internal conflicts. The question of who should lead the Ummah, which had arisen after Muhammad's death, was never fully resolved. A dispute over the succession led to the First Islamic Civil War, or Fitna. This conflict resulted in the great schism in Islam between the Sunni and the Shia, a division that continues to shape the politics of the Middle East to this day. The caliphate itself moved from the pious austerity of the first caliphs to the dynastic rule of the Umayyad family, who ruled from Damascus. They were in turn overthrown by the Abbasids, who moved the capital to a magnificent new city they built on the banks of the Tigris, near the ruins of ancient Babylon. They called it Baghdad. Under the Abbasid caliphs, the Islamic world entered its golden age. While Europe was mired in the Dark Ages, Baghdad became the intellectual center of the world. Its House of Wisdom was a library and translation institute that dwarfed any in Christendom. Scholars translated the works of the ancient Greeks, Plato, Aristotle, Euclid, into Arabic, preserving them for posterity. They made groundbreaking advances in mathematics, inventing algebra. They made discoveries in medicine, optics, and astronomy. This was a civilization of vibrant cities, thriving trade, and breathtaking intellectual curiosity. Yet even at the height of its glory, the Abbasid Caliphate was beginning to fracture. Its vast size made it difficult to govern. Provincial governors became de facto independent rulers. Rival caliphates were established in Egypt and Spain. The political unity of the Islamic world was broken. The caliph in Baghdad was still the spiritual head of Sunni Islam, but his temporal power was shrinking, and a new threat was emerging from the north. Turkish nomadic tribes from Central Asia, who had been employed as slave soldiers, or Mamluks, began to seize power for themselves. A new dynasty, the Seljuk Turks, conquered Persia and Mesopotamia and became the protectors of the Abbasid Caliph. They were fierce warriors and devout Sunni Muslims. In the year 1071, a Seljuk army met a Byzantine army at the Battle of Manzikert in eastern Anatolia. The Byzantines were defeated and their emperor was captured. This battle was a catastrophe for Byzantium. It opened the heartland of Anatolia to Turkish settlement, permanently altering the demographics of the region. The Byzantine emperor, in his desperation, sent a letter to the Pope in Rome asking for help. He was hoping for a few thousand mercenaries. What he got was a crusade. What would you trust more in a moment of crisis? The stability of a powerful central authority, or the innovative spirit of a collection of independent thinkers? Share your choice with us. The call for aid from the Byzantine emperor was transformed by Pope Urban II into something far grander and more dangerous. At the Council of Clermont in the year 1095, he delivered a fiery sermon calling on the knights of Europe to stop fighting each other and embark on a holy war to reclaim Jerusalem from Muslim rule. He promised forgiveness of sins for all who went. The response was overwhelming. This was the First Crusade, a strange and volatile mix of religious piety, feudal ambition, and landless greed. It was not a single, organized army, but a chaotic movement of several waves. The first wave, the so-called People's Crusade, was an undisciplined mob of peasants and minor knights who were slaughtered almost as soon as they entered Turkish territory. But the main force, the army of the great feudal lords of Europe, was a different matter. They were professional warriors, heavily armored knights who fought on horseback with lances and broadswords. They were a formidable military force. They marched for 3 years across thousands of miles, enduring starvation, disease, and constant battle. They captured the great cities of Nicaea and Antioch, and in the summer of 1999, they stood before the walls of Jerusalem. The siege of Jerusalem was the brutal culmination of the First Crusade. After weeks of fighting, the Crusaders breached the walls. The slaughter that followed was horrific, even by the standards of the age. The Crusaders, inflamed by religious zeal and the hardships of their long journey, massacred the city's Muslim and Jewish inhabitants without mercy. They waded through streets that were, according to one chronicler, ankle-deep in blood. With the capture of Jerusalem, the Crusaders established 4 feudal states in the Levant: the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the County of Tripoli, the Principality of Antioch, and the County of Edessa. These Crusader states were European colonies, outposts of Christendom in a hostile land. They built massive, magnificent castles like Crac des Chevaliers to defend their new territories. But they were always a minority, ruling over a population of Muslims and local Christians. Their survival depended on a steady flow of reinforcements from Europe and the disunity of their Muslim neighbors. For a time, that disunity was their greatest asset. The Seljuk Empire was fragmenting, and local Muslim rulers were more interested in fighting each other than in uniting against the Franks, as they called the Crusaders. This situation could not last. A powerful force for Muslim unity was emerging. His name was Imad al-Din Zengi, the Turkish ruler of Mosul and Aleppo. He began to roll back the Crusader gains, capturing the city of Edessa in 1144. This prompted the call for a second crusade from Europe, which ended in a dismal failure. The real catalyst for change, however, was a man who served Zengi's son. He was a Kurd named Salah al-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, known to the West as Saladin. Saladin was a brilliant military commander, a shrewd politician, and a devout Muslim. He methodically united the Muslim territories of Egypt and Syria under his rule, creating a powerful state that surrounded the Crusader kingdoms. He was patient. He built his strength, waiting for the right moment to strike. He embodied a new spirit of jihad, or holy struggle, to reclaim Jerusalem. The Crusaders, meanwhile, were becoming complacent and divided. A particularly reckless and fanatical faction, led by Reynaud of Châtillon, repeatedly broke truces with Saladin, attacking Muslim caravans and pilgrim ships. The final provocation came when Reynaud attacked a large caravan that included Saladin's own sister. Saladin swore an oath to kill Reynaud with his own hands. The stage was set for a decisive confrontation. In the summer of 1187, Saladin invaded the Kingdom of Jerusalem. The Crusader army, led by their king, Guy of Lusignan, made a fatal strategic error. They marched out to meet Saladin's army in the open field, away from their fortified castles and sources of water. Saladin's forces cornered the Crusader army near a pair of extinct volcanic hills known as the Horns of Hattin. The battle took place in blistering July heat. The Crusaders were tormented by thirst, harassed by Saladin's horse archers, and choked by the smoke from brush fires set by the enemy. After a day of suffering, the Crusader army was exhausted and demoralized. The next day, Saladin ordered the final attack. The Crusader infantry broke and fled. The knights, fighting on foot after their horses were killed, made a desperate last stand around the king's red tent. It was hopeless. The army was annihilated. The king was captured, along with most of his nobles. The sacred relic of the true cross was lost. Saladin was true to his word. He personally beheaded Reynaud of Châtillon. The Battle of Hattin was an unmitigated disaster for the Crusaders. It destroyed their main army and left their kingdom virtually defenseless. City after city surrendered to Saladin. A few months later, he stood before Jerusalem. The city surrendered with little bloodshed. Saladin, in stark contrast to the Crusader conquest 90 years earlier, forbade any massacre of the Christian population. The fall of Jerusalem sent shockwaves through Europe. It prompted the Third Crusade, the most famous of them all. This was the Crusade of Kings, led by the three greatest rulers in Europe: Frederick Barbarossa of the Holy Roman Empire, Philip Augustus of France, and Richard I of England, known as the Lionheart. It was an epic confrontation. Frederick drowned while crossing a river in Anatolia. Philip quarreled with Richard and went home. But Richard the Lionheart, a brilliant and ruthless military commander, pressed on. For 2 years, Richard and Saladin fought a war of maneuver and siege along the coast of Palestine. It was a duel between two legendary figures marked by a strange and chivalrous respect. They never met, but they exchanged gifts and messages. Richard recaptured the port city of Acre in a long and brutal siege, but he could never take Jerusalem. In the end, they signed a truce. The Crusaders would hold a narrow strip of coastal territory, and Christian pilgrims would be allowed to visit Jerusalem peacefully. Richard sailed for home, and Saladin died a few months later. The age of the Crusades was not over. There would be several more, but they were increasingly cynical and misdirected affairs. The Crusader states dwindled, clinging to a few coastal cities, until the last one, Acre, fell to the Egyptian Mamluks in 1291. The 200-year war for the Holy Land had ended. The Crusaders had failed to secure it for Christendom, but their presence had irrevocably changed the region, leaving a legacy of bitterness and mistrust. And now a new, far more terrible storm was gathering in the Far East. It was a storm that would make the wars of the Cross and Crescent look like a playground squabble. It was the Mongol maelstrom. The rise of the Mongols was a demographic and military explosion without parallel in human history. From the harsh steppes of Central Asia, a tribal leader named Temujin, later known as Genghis Khan, united the warring nomadic tribes into a single, unstoppable war machine. The Mongol army was not large, but it was composed entirely of cavalry. Every soldier was a superb horseman and a deadly archer. They moved with incredible speed, communicated with a sophisticated system of signals, and employed tactics of feigned retreat, encirclement, and psychological terror that overwhelmed every army they faced. After conquering China and Central Asia, the Mongol hordes turned west. In the year 1258, a Mongol army led by Hulagu Khan, a grandson of Genghis, arrived at the gates of Baghdad. Baghdad was no longer the political heart of the Islamic world, but it was still its cultural and intellectual soul. It was a city of libraries, observatories, and palaces. The Caliph, al-Mustasim, was a weak and indecisive ruler. He refused to surrender. The siege was short. The Mongols, masters of siegecraft, learned from the Chinese, breached the walls in less than 2 weeks. The destruction that followed was apocalyptic. For an entire week, the city was given over to slaughter and pillage. The numbers are likely exaggerated by horrified chroniclers, but they speak of hundreds of thousands, perhaps over 1 million, dead. The city's libraries, including the Great House of Wisdom, were destroyed. The books were thrown into the Tigris River, and it was said the water ran black with ink for days. The caliph was rolled in a carpet and trampled to death by horses, so that royal blood would not be spilled on the earth. The sack of Baghdad was a trauma from which the Islamic world never fully recovered. It marked the definitive end of the Abbasid Caliphate and the Islamic Golden Age. The Mongol tide seemed unstoppable. They swept into Syria, taking Aleppo and Damascus. They were poised to invade Egypt, the last major Muslim power. But in the year 1260, at a place called Ain Jalut, or the Spring of Goliath, in Palestine, the Mongol advance was finally halted. The Egyptian army was composed of Mamluks, the same kind of Turkish slave soldiers who had once served the Abbasids. They were superb cavalry and they understood Mongol tactics. In a decisive battle, the Mamluks drew the Mongol force into a trap and destroyed it. It was the first time a Mongol army had ever been decisively defeated in the field. Ain Jalut was one of the most important battles in world history. It saved Egypt and the holy cities of Mecca and Medina from destruction. It marked the high watermark of the Mongol conquest in the Middle East. Hulagu's portion of the empire, known as the Ilkhanate, would rule over Persia and Iraq for a century, but it would never again threaten the heartlands of Islam. The Mongol invasions, though devastating, had a paradoxical effect. They shattered the old political order, creating a power vacuum, and from the chaos and rubble, a new power would eventually rise. In the northwestern corner of Anatolia, among the shattered remnants of the Seljuk Sultanate, a small Turkish principality was beginning to grow, led by a chieftain named Osman. His followers would become known as the Ottomans. The rise of the Ottomans was slow, methodical, and relentless. While other Turkish emirates in Anatolia fought among themselves, the Ottomans focused their energies on expanding into the decaying territory of the Byzantine Empire in the Balkans. They were pragmatic. They adopted new military technologies, particularly gunpowder weapons like cannons and muskets. They created an elite infantry corps, the Janissaries, composed of Christian boys taken from the Balkans, converted to Islam, and raised to be fiercely loyal soldiers of the Sultan. For over a century, they tightened their grip on the Balkans, surrounding the ancient city of Constantinople on all sides. By the mid-15th century, the Byzantine Empire was a pathetic shadow of its former self, consisting of little more than the city itself and a few scattered territories. The city's massive walls, which had repelled dozens of sieges for over 1,000 years, were its only defense. In the spring of 1453, the young Ottoman Sultan, Mehmed II, arrived before those walls with a massive army and a new, terrifying weapon, giant siege cannons. One, nicknamed the Basilica, was so large it could fire a 1,200-pound stone ball over a mile. The siege of Constantinople was the final act of a 1,000-year drama. For 53 days, the vastly outnumbered defenders, a mix of Greeks, Venetians, and Genoese, held out against constant bombardment and repeated assaults. The last Byzantine emperor, Constantine XI, fought and died on the walls, a hero's end for a dying empire. On the 29th of May, 1453, the Janissaries breached the walls. The city fell. Mehmed II, now known as the Conqueror, rode his horse into the great cathedral of Hagia Sophia and declared it a mosque. The fall of Constantinople was a world-shaking event. It marked the end of the Roman Empire, the final link to the ancient world. It sent a wave of terror through Christian Europe and a wave of jubilation through the Muslim world. For the Ottomans, it was the dawn of a new age. Constantinople, renamed Istanbul, became the capital of a new, powerful, and ambitious empire. For the next few centuries, the Ottoman Empire would be a global superpower, its armies threatening Vienna, its navies controlling the Mediterranean. The crescent had replaced the cross over the city of Constantine. You've witnessed the end of one civilization and the birth of another. In the grand sweep of history, is it better to be a member of a great empire at its glorious peak, or a citizen of a small state during its heroic, desperate struggle for survival? Let us know what you think. For 2 centuries after the conquest of Constantinople, the Ottoman Empire was the most powerful state in the world. Under a series of brilliant sultans like Selim the Grim and Suleiman the Magnificent, its borders expanded dramatically. They conquered the Mamluk Sultanate in Egypt and Syria, bringing the holy cities of Mecca and Medina under their protection. The Ottoman Sultan was now also the Caliph of Sunni Islam. They conquered Iraq from the Safavid Persians, their great Shia rivals to the east. Their armies pushed deep into Europe, laying siege to Vienna twice. Their navy, commanded by corsairs like Barbarossa, dominated the Mediterranean Sea. Istanbul was the largest and wealthiest city in Europe, a cosmopolitan hub of trade and culture. The empire was a complex, multi-ethnic, multi-religious state, governed by a sophisticated bureaucracy. But by the 18th century, the empire was showing signs of stagnation. A series of weak and incompetent sultans led to political instability. Military defeats at the hands of rising European powers like Austria and Russia began to chip away at its frontiers. The Ottoman military, once the most advanced in the world, had failed to keep pace with European innovations. The empire became known as the sick man of Europe, a decaying power whose territories were ripe for the pluck by ambitious rivals. This weakness did not go unnoticed. The great powers of Europe began to circle, eager to carve up the Ottoman Empire and seize its valuable territories. This long, slow process of diplomatic maneuvering and colonial predation became known as the Eastern Question. The first dramatic intrusion of modern Europe into the heart of the Middle East came in 1798. A young, brilliant, and impossibly ambitious French general named Napoleon Bonaparte landed in Egypt with an army. His aims were grandiose: to cut Britain's lifeline to India, and perhaps even to emulate Alexander the Great and march east. The Ottoman province of Egypt was ruled by a decadent Mamluk warrior class. At the Battle of the Pyramids, Napoleon's disciplined French squares, armed with modern muskets and bayonets, easily shattered the Mamluks' medieval cavalry charges. It was a brutal demonstration of the technological and tactical gap that had opened up between Europe and the Middle East. Napoleon's Egyptian adventure was ultimately a failure. His fleet was destroyed by the British Admiral Horatio Nelson at the Battle of the Nile, stranding his army. He eventually abandoned his troops and slipped back to France. But his invasion had a profound impact. It shattered the illusion of Ottoman invincibility and exposed the region's vulnerability to European power. Napoleon's invasion was a wake-up call. It sparked the beginning of modernizing reforms within the Ottoman Empire, but it was too little, too late. It also set the stage for the rise of a remarkable new leader in Egypt. Muhammad Ali was an Albanian officer in the Ottoman army sent to drive out the French. He was cunning, ruthless, and visionary. He seized power in Egypt, massacred the old Mamluk leadership, and established his own dynasty. He then embarked on a radical program of modernization. He built a modern, European-style army and navy. He reformed the administration and the tax system. He sent educational missions to Europe. He effectively turned Egypt into his own private empire, waging successful wars against the Sultan in Greece and Syria. He was only stopped from conquering Istanbul itself by the intervention of the European powers who preferred a weak Ottoman Empire they could manipulate to a strong, independent Egypt. Muhammad Ali's project ultimately failed to create a lasting, powerful Middle Eastern state, but he had shown what was possible. Meanwhile, the two great colonial rivals of the 19th century, Britain and Russia, were playing their own great game. This was a Cold War of spies, diplomats, and explorers fought for influence and control over the territories stretching from the Ottoman Empire through Persia and Afghanistan to the borders of British India. Russia sought to expand south, seeking warm water ports. Britain sought to protect its Indian empire, its jewel in the crown. The Middle East became a chessboard for these imperial powers. One of the most significant geopolitical developments of the century was the construction of the Suez Canal. The brainchild of French diplomat Ferdinand de Lesseps, it was built with Egyptian labor and French money. Opened in 1869, it was a marvel of modern engineering, a waterway connecting the Mediterranean and the Red Sea. It revolutionized global trade by dramatically shortening the sea route from Europe to Asia. For Britain, the canal was a vital strategic artery, the lifeline to India. Egypt's ruler, Ismail Pasha, Muhammad Ali's grandson, was a profligate spender who drove the country deep into debt to European banks. In 1875, he was forced to sell Egypt's shares in the Suez Canal Company to raise money. The British government, under Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli, secretly and swiftly bought them. This gave Britain effective control of the canal. A few years later, using the pretext of a nationalist uprising, British troops occupied Egypt. They would remain for the next 70 years. The colonial division of the Middle East was well underway. The Ottomans were losing control of their provinces one by one. Nationalist uprisings, often encouraged by European powers, were breaking out in the Balkans. The Greeks, Serbs, and Romanians all won their independence. The sick man was fading fast. The great powers were simply waiting for him to die, sharpening their knives to carve up the inheritance. The stage was being set for a final global conflict that would shatter the old order and redraw the map of the world. The final act for the Ottoman Empire came with the outbreak of the First World War in 1914. The empire's leadership, a group of young nationalistic officers known as the Young Turks, made the fatal decision to enter the war on the side of Germany and Austria-Hungary. They hoped to regain lost territories and throw off the yoke of financial control imposed by Britain and France. It was a disastrous gamble. The Ottoman army was ill-equipped and poorly led. It fought on multiple fronts, against the Russians in the Caucasus, against the British in Mesopotamia and Palestine, and in one of its few successes, against a combined British, Australian, New Zealand and French force at Gallipoli. The Dardanelles campaign, better known as the Battle of Gallipoli, was a bold Allied plan to seize the Straits and knock the Ottoman Empire out of the war. It turned into a bloody 9-month stalemate, a brutal campaign of trench warfare that ended in a humiliating Allied evacuation. It was a great defensive victory for the Ottomans, but it could not change the tide of the war. On other fronts, the empire was crumbling. The war also provided a cover for the Young Turk government to carry out a horrific genocide against the Armenian Christian minority, whom they accused of sympathizing with the Russians. Over 1 million people were systematically killed or died on forced marches into the Syrian desert. While Ottoman armies were fighting and dying in the trenches, the British were busy plotting the empire's dismemberment. They saw an opportunity to use Arab nationalism as a weapon. They sought out Hussein bin Ali, the Sharif of Mecca, the guardian of the holy cities. They promised him that if he would lead an Arab revolt against the Turks, Britain would support the creation of a great independent Arab kingdom after the war. This was a lie. While British officers like the enigmatic Thomas Edward Lawrence, later known as Lawrence of Arabia, were advising and supplying the Arab rebels, British and French diplomats were secretly carving up the future spoils. In 1916, Mark Sykes of Britain and François-Georges Picot of France negotiated a secret treaty. The Sykes-Picot Agreement was a classic piece of colonial arrogance. It was a plan to divide the Arab provinces of the Ottoman Empire into British and French spheres of influence. France would get Syria and Lebanon. Britain would get Iraq, Jordan, and Palestine. The lines they drew on the map were arbitrary, ignoring ethnic, religious, and tribal realities. They were lines drawn in the sand with a ruler, creating artificial states that would be plagued by instability for the next century. Decisions made in the drawing rooms of London and Paris would become time bombs, their fuses lit and burning down to the present day. As if this duplicity were not enough, the British made a third, contradictory promise. In 1917, seeking to gain the support of the worldwide Jewish community for the Allied war effort, the British government issued the Balfour Declaration. It was a short letter from the Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour to Lord Rothschild, a leader of the British Jewish community. It stated that the British government viewed with favour the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. The declaration was deliberately vague. It did not promise a state, but a national home. It also included a caveat that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine. At the time, the existing non-Jewish communities constituted over 90% of the population. The Balfour Declaration was a profound contradiction to the promise of an independent Arab kingdom. The British had effectively promised the same small piece of land to two different peoples. In the middle of all this diplomatic maneuvering and betrayal, something else was discovered that would forever change the strategic calculus of the region. Prospectors, working for a British company in Persia, had struck vast reserves of petroleum. Then, even larger fields were found in Iraq and along the Persian Gulf. Suddenly, the barren deserts of the Middle East were not just holy lands, they were sitting on top of the world's most important industrial resource: oil. The thirst for it would fuel a new era of foreign intervention, coups, and conflicts that continues to this day. The war ended in 1918. The Ottoman Empire was defeated and dismantled. The age of empires was over. The age of mandates, oil concessions, and bitter, irreconcilable nationalisms was just beginning. The end of the First World War did not bring peace or independence to the Middle East. It brought a new form of colonialism. The League of Nations granted Britain and France mandates to govern the territories carved out of the defunct Ottoman Empire. France took control of Syria and Lebanon. Britain took Iraq, Transjordan, and Palestine. The Arabs, who had fought for their freedom, felt profoundly betrayed. The new borders were artificial and divisive. Iraq was cobbled together from three disparate Ottoman provinces, forcing Sunni, Shia, and Kurdish populations into a single, unstable state. The British installed a Hashemite king, Faisal, son of the Sharif of Mecca, to rule it. They gave his brother, Abdullah, a new kingdom they created out of thin air, Transjordan. But the most volatile and difficult mandate was Palestine. Here, the contradictory promises of the Sykes-Picot Agreement and the Balfour Declaration collided head-on. The British found themselves caught between two growing and increasingly hostile nationalist movements. The Zionist movement encouraged Jewish immigration to Palestine with the goal of creating a Jewish state. The local Arab population, watching their country change before their eyes, developed a fierce Palestinian Arab nationalism of their own. Throughout the 1920s and 1930s, tensions escalated. There were riots, strikes, and attacks by both sides. The British responded with commissions of inquiry, white papers, and brutal police actions. They tried to restrict Jewish immigration to appease the Arabs, then relaxed the restrictions to appease the Jews. They were trapped in a quagmire of their own making. The rise of Nazism in Europe in the 1930s created a new, desperate urgency for Jewish immigration, further fueling the conflict. The Second World War temporarily overshadowed the conflict in Palestine, but the end of the war brought it to a boiling point. Britain, exhausted and bankrupt, no longer had the will or the resources to maintain its empire. It announced its intention to withdraw from Palestine and hand the problem over to the newly formed United Nations. In 1947, the United Nations voted to partition Palestine into two states, one Arab and one Jewish, with Jerusalem to be an international city. The Jewish leadership accepted the plan. The Arab states and the Palestinian Arabs rejected it outright. As the British withdrew, a civil war erupted. On May 14, 1948, the day the British mandate expired, the Jewish leader David Ben-Gurion proclaimed the establishment of the State of Israel. The very next day, the armies of 5 neighboring Arab states, Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq, invaded. The first Arab-Israeli war, known to Israelis as the War of Independence and to Palestinians as the Nakba, or the catastrophe, had begun. The new State of Israel, though outnumbered and poorly armed at first, fought for its survival with desperate determination. By the time an armistice was signed in 1949, Israel had not only survived, but had expanded its territory beyond the borders of the UN partition plan. For the Palestinians, the war was a disaster. Over 700,000 of them fled or were expelled from their homes, becoming refugees in the neighboring Arab states. Their dream of a state was shattered. The creation of Israel and the displacement of the Palestinians became the central, defining conflict of the modern Middle East, a wound that has yet to heal. The decades that followed were a relentless cycle of war and stalemate. In 1956, the Suez Crisis saw Israel, Britain, and France invade Egypt after its nationalist leader, Gamal Abdel Nasser, nationalized the Suez Canal. They were forced to withdraw under pressure from the United States of America and the Soviet Union, but the incident solidified Nasser's status as a hero of the Arab world. Tensions continued to mount, culminating in the Six-Day War of 1967. In a stunning preemptive strike, the Israeli Air Force destroyed the air forces of Egypt, Syria and Jordan on the ground. In the 6 days of fighting that followed, Israel captured the Sinai Peninsula and the Gaza Strip from Egypt, the West Bank and East Jerusalem from Jordan, and the Golan Heights from Syria. It was a military victory of shocking proportions, but it came at a price. Israel was now an occupying power, ruling over more than 1 million Palestinians in the newly captured territories. The dream of a quick peace was replaced by the grim reality of a long, bitter occupation. The Arab states, humiliated and defeated, refused to recognize or negotiate with Israel. The cycle of violence seemed unbreakable. In October 1973, on the holiest day of the Jewish calendar, Yom Kippur, Egypt and Syria launched a surprise attack. They sought to regain the territory they had lost in 1967. The Yom Kippur War was the closest and most brutal of the Arab-Israeli conflicts. The Israeli army, caught by surprise, suffered heavy casualties in the initial days, but it managed to regroup and, with a massive airlift of military supplies from the United States, push back the Arab armies. The war ended in a stalemate, but it shattered Israel's image of invincibility. It also paved the way for a major diplomatic breakthrough. The Egyptian president Anwar Sadat, in a courageous and historic move, flew to Jerusalem and addressed the Israeli Knesset, offering peace. This led to the Camp David Accords, brokered by United States President Jimmy Carter, and a peace treaty between Israel and Egypt in 1979. It was the first time an Arab state had officially recognized Israel, but the core of the conflict, the fate of the Palestinians, remained unresolved. The Lebanon War in 1982, Palestinian uprisings known as the Intifadas, cycles of suicide bombings and military incursions, failed peace processes, and the rise of militant groups like Hamas and Hezbollah have marked the subsequent decades. The story of the Middle East, which began with the building of walls between the first cities, has come full circle. It is now a story of concrete separation barriers, fortified borders, and seemingly irreconcilable claims to the same small piece of land, a land where every stone remembers blood. The history of the Middle East is an eternal dispute between memory and ambition. Some say that to achieve peace, old grievances must be forgotten. Others say that without historical justice, peace is impossible. What do you think is more important for the future of this region, all-forgiving oblivion or merciless justice? Write your choice in the comments, because this story concerns everyone.